Hi, I'm Jeff Ray, your host for Economic Outlook. We're back for a new season of the show. Thank you for joining us again. We believe we have a great season ahead of us, and we hope you'll make plans to join us each week on WNIT, WNIT2, online at WNIT.org, or listen to our podcast of the show on most major podcast platforms. We plan to give you an inside look each week into the regional economy and some of the key projects helping our region grow. We'll invite key guests to join me, and we'll also go visit some of those projects to give you a closer look. Joining me this week to kick off our season is a familiar face, George Lepiniotis, my co-host here at WNIT, coming up on Economic Outlook. Whether you're on the shores of Lake Michigan or the lakes of Kosciuszko County or anywhere in between, you're seeing signs of economic growth that is changing and improving the community that you live in. Each week we do take a deep dive into those projects and stories, and we bring them right into your home. My partner in crime for this effort has been George Lepiniotis, an attorney here regionally with Krieg Duvall, and my co-host on WNIT's Economic Outlook. Please join me in welcoming George to our show today for a look ahead at the new season. George, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having me back to the studio. Always a nice place to be.
Yeah, it's great to see you. We've had a kind of a strange year last year. Obviously, the pandemic put a kink in our plans to get out and around, but we still brought a show with a lot of great economy stories. We weren't able to plug you in quite as much because of social distancing. So I want to say welcome back. We're glad to have you back in the studio today. George, let me start, but so people who don't know, this isn't your day job. What do you do on a normal day-to-day basis?
Yeah, no, daily I'm an attorney with Krieg Duvall. My practice is focused on corporate mergers, acquisitions, as well as some real estate matters. We are an Indiana law firm, first and foremost, and I am proud to serve in our Mishawaka office. Yeah, that's my day job.
Great. So George, a couple of years ago, we had the chance to get teamed up here on Economic Outlook, and it's been a really fun time to have this partnership here. So talk a little bit about WNIT and becoming involved here and why this is important to you. You're a busy guy, but you've made this a priority.
Yeah, I'm very busy, and it's something that I make time for simply because I believe in the power of positive media. And I think that what WNIT does for our community and what other PBS stations across the country do for their communities is focus on those stories, especially with local productions, if they're privileged enough to have a local production like what we have, and we actually have a number of them. You're able to focus efforts and a spotlight on the stories that shape your communities. It's easy to watch national media and to focus on stories that may or may not have as big of an impact on our communities as we're told they do. I think the content that you and I and our other sister shows here at the station bring to Michiana really do hit home. These are people, places, companies that hire our coworkers, they hire our neighbors, they hire our friends and family. It's where we see success in our community and where we're seeing our communities grow. So I don't know of a more worthwhile cause than that.
That's great, and George, you hit on several, politically speaking, education counts, dinner and book, just a wide variety of great programming here, and I think this station does it as good as any of them, and some great specials. This summer, for example, the special on the St. Joe River, and so think about how that ties our communities together and the important piece that has played in commerce. So to have the station help us better understand the story and the history, I think is as you mentioned, like a really neat asset for our community to really see those stories.
Yeah, without a station like this, those stories may not get told. And I know our local franchise news stations, WSBT and WNDU and the like, are all very professional outfits, and they do a nice job of telling the news, but sometimes they don't have the time or the inclination to tell some of these different stories that we're able to focus on. And I also like that we really do keep it positive. I tell people before I take them down that interview path that we're not here to hit. We're here to promote, and we're here to help highlight the positive things that you're doing.
Maybe we should change it up this year. What do you think? Want to be hard hitting, go after them this year,
I think we're okay. I think
All
there's
right.
enough of that out there.
Okay, no, I think you're right, and I think what's been fun for us is the chance to tell the stories of the economy, and I love the geography a little bit to think about how tied together sometimes, but how uniquely different at the same time is it when you go all the way up to Lake Michigan and the St. Joe Benton Harbor and New Buffalo and stretch all the way down to Kosciuszko County, and we've been to Elkhart and Culver and Plymouth and really tried to hit every town a little bit. There's some great stories in each of them, and my hope, I guess, is this year we get a chance to uncover more of those and go back. So I want to put you in the Wayback Machine here for a minute and ask you to go back in time though too. So you've had a chance during our time together to go out and visit some great projects. And so what sticks out to you as some of those memorable great projects, those that come to the top of your mind in terms of the regional economy?
Yeah. We've told so many great stories, and I've been to so many great places to visit businesses or projects that have such a meaningful impact, from the Indiana Toll Road to the redevelopment of some communities up in Michigan, downtown Benton Harbor, the Arts District, Harbor Shores. All of those are very important to our regional economy, but I got to tell you, there's probably a couple that are near and dear to my heart that I had a lot of fun with. The first, and this will probably stay my favorite episode, is going to Clay's Candy before Christmas. Clay's Candy, as you well know, is a local, long-time candy manufacturer, making it right here in South Bend. And we've all had Chocolate Charlie. We've all had those yellow boxes during the holidays. And it was really a heartwarming story. A family business, following that same recipe and the same philosophy that they did 100 years ago. Matter of fact, I hope to see them again. I see they're increasing their presence, and they're building a new facility on the outskirts of South Bend that gives them a little bit more room to grow, which was one of the challenges they had when I went to visit their factory.
Yeah, first I want to say thanks for bringing all those treats back to us. Oh wait, I don't remember seeing those, but I'm sure.
They didn't make it,
Oh,
Jeff.
okay,
They
all
didn't
right,
make it. They spoiled in
Yeah.
my car. Yeah.
But you mentioned though, what a great chance for us to tell the Clay's story. For example, 100 years, very few businesses survive that many generations, survive that many years. Clay's has done it and been prominent, and now, as you mentioned, under construction on Nimps Parkway with a new state-of-the-art facility, which will prepare them really, hopefully, for the next 100 years. And so,
Right.
so for us to have had a chance to see inside kind of how it all worked before, Chocolate Charlie's been a staple, a favorite for everybody here, but most people hadn't had a chance to see how it was made until you took us inside the factory to do that. So appreciate
Making
you doing
marshmallows
that.
by hand, man.
Yeah,
I
so
mean, it's just very cool.
Yeah, so as soon as it gets cold and snowy, we'll send you out to the site to
Yeah, do that for me, would you
cover
please? I always appreciate the elements.
the new construction. I mean, I just take that from regular TV, right?
Yeah.
Send the guy out in the field out to on those cold days and stuff. So we'll send you out that way.
And I think for those of us that don't know, or some of our viewers who don't know us well, we are friends offset.
Right.
We are very close, and we tend to banter, don't we?
We do, yes.
And so you do take pride in the fact that you find the muddiest, wettest spots to send me on some of these shoots. So thank you for that.
Right, good. I've got a whole new list for this year that we're working on. So, any others in particular that because I think what's been neat about you being out in the field is you've been able to show us the front end of some of these projects, maybe before construction, or you've talked a little bit with developers or others about what's happening. So, as time has gone on and some of those near completion, what are some of the spots that you'd like to go back to visit as
Sure.
we're thinking about this year and where we go?
Yeah. I'll tell you, one of the projects that I thought was really interesting, and I don't know that they're going to be ready this year, but there was the redevelopment of the theater in downtown Plymouth. Mm-hmm. And that theater was, again, another 100-year-old structure that has undergone significant modernization while keeping the original feel and historical element of the place. It's one of the reasons that I'm always proud to be from this area. I think that we really are traditionalists. We believe in our history, and we believe in who we are fundamentally, and seeing a community come together and revitalize a historic monument like the downtown movie theater, while installing solar panels and alternative energy sources and modern insulation techniques. I mean, it's just such a dichotomy of thoughts and ideas and belief, and couldn't get any better than that. So that's one of the ones I'm excited to go back and see. I don't know if it's going to be this season. I don't know how far along they've come. I'm also excited to see some redevelopment in downtown Benton Harbor. There is a residential structure being invested in by an ownership group out of South Bend here, and making a positive impact in that community, along with our friends up at what I call Cornerstone Alliance, but I think they've changed their name. Really excited to see that, and I think we'll have an opportunity to see some of those high-end residential units downtown Benton Harbor.
Yeah, it's great. Before the show airs, before this show airs, Elkhart will celebrate the opening of the Elkhart Hotel, another place that you had a chance to go visit. And it's interesting because all of these make me think a little bit about downtown and kind of what's happening. So over the years as you've been out in the field and as we've talked and done the show, any consistent themes or things that have come together? Like, I think of the downtowns as being a really critical focus for us, and you've got a chance to really see what's happening at the Mill in downtown Mishawaka, in downtown Elkhart, at places like the Elkhart Hotel, or in the River District there. LaPorte's got some major downtowns. South Bend's got, So talk a little bit about just sort of your trips to the downtowns and why that downtown investment is so important.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. We as a region, we don't have a metropolis. We don't have South Bend is as large of a city as you're going to find, and it even is not one city. It truly is a conglomeration of South Bend, Mishawaka, Granger, and the outlying communities that make it what it is, a super regional area. I often say I grew up in Michigan, but a lot of what we did was here in South Bend, shopping, dining, education, medical facilities, those sorts of things, and I think that really stands true to our community. The downtowns are definitely seeing their day in the sun. Long neglected downtowns, after that shift away from that pattern of commercialization of those areas. I think they have a ways to go, but we are definitely seeing positive upticks, and I think that's great for our communities and really does define who we are as a region, doesn't it? I mean, we are really a rural region, and those small downtowns are places that we enjoy being.
Yeah, when you think about the 750,000+ people here that are in our region or in our media area that we're reaching out to, there are so many great stories and great places to visit, and the station does a great job, I think, in their different platforms of trying to help draw attention to those areas so that folks can go enjoy it. So overall, I think. Generally, the activity's been pretty positive. How are you feeling about the overall economy, if you will? Obviously we pay a lot of attention to that. I think most people would say we went through a period of time in the 2000s where things weren't so well. I think the recession in 2008, but I think generally, as we've been out and around, I've been feeling pretty positive. Give us your George the Economist, take on sort of the economy here.
Well, it's funny. I know you've had some very outstanding economists sitting here at this chair. That's not me, but I will tell you that from my perspective, my clients are actively pursuing deals. They are merging, they are acquiring, they are developing. There is general enthusiasm about our economy. And I would say that Michiana as a whole, across its regions, across its political pockets, is fiscally conservative. I've not been to a community that I believe is fiscally irresponsible. And so when they are moving, when they are making investments, you feel good about it because you really do feel confident that the leaders of those communities or the business leaders in those communities are not making foolish fiscal decisions. So I think despite challenging times, we are full steam ahead on the economic front, which is what this show is about. There's not enough shows. You mentioned last year I was not able to go out into the field because of some of our COVID restrictions. But there's just so many stories to tell. And it's great to be that way. It's great to feel that vibrancy.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting year just across the region. A couple things with just some investment opportunities. You mentioned we're sort of seeing investment happen in a lot of different places. The federal government has infused a fair amount of dollars into our marketplace to help local communities move forward on projects. We think an infrastructure bill could follow, which means some more dollars to knock off key infrastructure projects. Our region's working on READY. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that this year. The state put a program together that maybe makes us eligible for up to $50 million of state funding that would match local funding. So when you think about regional cities, and we talked a lot previously about regional cities on the show, we were able to leverage $42 million of state investment in regional cities and get about $400 million of investment in our community overall. So some of the places you took us, to the Mill, to Howard Park, to the Elkhart Riverfront, all those, to the Aquatic Center, all those places really benefited by kind of the public-private partnerships that helped make them go. And I think READY is shaping up to for a new opportunity that our application goes in at the end of October, and near the beginning of October, and then we're hoping by Christmas we would know how much money is available there, and you could potentially see some other key projects going forward.
And Jeff, for those of our viewers that maybe aren't ready with the acronyms, I mean, Regional Cities was a state-level Indiana Economic Development Program, and like you said, those funds that the state made available to its regional cities were specifically designed to address the needs of some deteriorating downtowns, focused on what we call quality of place, to attract residents, to attract younger graduates and young professionals to come back to this region, or to come fresh to this region, to help sustain and grow our economic industries that really did need that and still do. We're still seeing a massive shortage in the workplace, and I think that the more investment that we can partner both with the federal and state government to bring dollars right here. These are not dollars that go anywhere but these communities that really do affect all of us. There couldn't be anything better. I know Michigan doesn't have something quite so aggressive as what the state of Indiana does, and for a number of reasons that I think would take a whole show to try to understand. But I think you just look at the impact that it's had on Elkhart, Mishawaka, South Bend, and you can't argue with the results.
Yep. So, George, last year we talked about, it was a complicated year. COVID put a kink in a lot of things, so I've asked you to wear your attorney hat, then your economist hat. Maybe I'll put your medical hat on now for a second. No, I'm kidding. But so we did a lot of shows last year talking about COVID's impact on business, on the economy, and such. As you're working with folks, or you're out, what's the feel about COVID these days out in the community?
Well, it depends on who I'm talking to.
That's true.
Right. I will generally say that we have pandemic fatigue.
Yeah.
When we last talked about this, I think, and I believe you still are, the St. Joe County COVID czar. You are in charge of the county's efforts and helping to lead those. And you probably feel that fatigue that our business community, our residents are feeling. There's large debate over where we stand. There are some who do not embrace the science, some that do not trust the solutions. I'm not sure that there's an answer for those questions, but I do think that as a community, I still believe that we can come together and show mutual respect and find solutions that make sense.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it earlier, just to reemphasize that for what we're seeing on the economic activity piece is encouraging. And so we're seeing deals get done, we're seeing projects getting talked about. It's interesting when I think about what's on the horizon or what's under construction. There's been some great news here lately about the new power plant up in Niles, for example. It's a $1.1 billion investment, a natural gas generating power plant. Never have we had a $1 billion investment here in our area. This sort of mirrors what happened in New Carlisle a few years ago with the power plant out there. And so we're feeding the power grid for 10 states in the Midwest. And so that's been a pretty important project underway. Last week I was out at a plant that is revolutionizing battery technology. We could be the center for battery technology. And think how many different things have a battery in it, right? My cell phone, my watch, my toothbrush, my computer, my iPhone, my car at some point. And so to think that we have innovative companies here, trying to revolutionize that. Recently announcement, the former Hummer plant, the electric last miles is producing an electric vehicle out of that plant that they've just got their first order for 1,000 of those, and trucks will begin rolling off the production line here relatively soon. We've seen solar projects. Several companies are benefiting, from the solar piece. We saw the RV industry do really well with COVID in particular. RV sales were pretty significant. Unemployment's down about 2% in Elkhart County. In the meantime,
quite the way to fight a pandemic, isn't it? If you look at previous large-scale events that have affected our society, the economy has not thrived the way it is currently. And I think that's a testament to the strength of our nation, the strength of our community, the strength of our institutions that have been built. And oftentimes lately they're getting abused, they're getting attacked. But the reality is that for what we're living through, we have really not suffered as badly as some previous generations have. And I specifically think of World War II, where women couldn't find silk to get married in, and there were rationing shortages, and we've seen very minor impact on our day-to-day lives, which is a testament to who we are.
Right. It's interesting to think about Elkhart in particular, with an unemployment rate close to 2%, major project called Project Winnie, moving through 1,800 jobs associated with that project. I think that'll be the news story of the fall, potentially. I think Elkhart reports are down to maybe a couple finalists for that site, rumored to be Amazon, but unknown there.
And 5-story distribution center.
Yeah, but you think about just those opportunities and I suppose employers are watching and sort of a little nervous about where do I find people, but there is a lot of focus on helping people better understand those opportunities and what they look like.
Yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed. We've went to visit some of our, what I'll call our workforce development institutions, IUSB and the Excel Center, for instance, that Goodwill has really made such a positive impact with. We definitely have all of the tools to overcome the challenges, and I think the bigger component now is really figuring out some of the uncertainties that the pandemic has created.
Yeah, so I'm going to shift in our last couple of minutes and talk transportation a little bit, because we've not only had you sitting on the side of the road, we've had you up on the train, and we've had you up at US 31 as those improvements are happening. The federal government's talking about major dollars to continue the boost of infrastructure. You've spent a lot of time at South Bend Airport. Just give us maybe a quick transportation summary, your observations, I think, from being out at some of those different transportation spots.
Yeah, no, and that was probably my second. We never got back to it after we got stuck on Candy, which is easy to do. But my second was always taking a ride on the South Shore. So we are blessed to be at the crossroads of America, and between the toll road that I mentioned already, the interstate highways, that expansion of US 31. I actually was driving up north, and construction is in full swing. And they are working really hard to reinvent that connection and to connect what we call the 31 bypass around South Bend. It becomes 20 east of us as it heads towards Elkhart, and 31 back down to Indianapolis. That will connect with I-94 and Interstate 96 up north, and really, I think, just further drive our reputation as being transportation centric. The airport, the South Bend International Airport, I'm sorry. If Mike Daigle's watching, he's going to be upset that I said region. It's an international airport. I think traffic is up. I know they've made some exciting developments in getting some commercial flights and routes to commit to SBN. We just, and of course the South Shore and that the two-track project is underway, as well as maybe reinventing that ride from South Bend. I don't know that we've gotten that far yet, but hopefully we'll put it on our 2021-22 agenda. Get out there and see what's going on and see where we stand with these projects, because they're all very exciting.
Great. Well, it sounds like we have a busy year ahead of us.
I think so, and I guess I should ask you. You are plugged in, right? Your day job focuses on developing our economy. You're the president of the Chamber of Commerce. Doesn't get any more plugged in than that.
It is, and I think that's what makes this partnership work so well. I'm grateful for the chance to work with you this coming year, and as always, this time goes by very fast, so we'll look forward to you telling some great stories. That's overall what we want to do, is make sure our viewers understand the great stories that exist here in the community. We appreciate what you do for not only the show, but for WNIT and for the community. So we look forward to working with you for another great year.
Same here. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. That's it for our show today. Thank you for watching on WNIT or listening to our podcast. To watch this episode again and any of our past episodes, you can find Economic Outlook at WNIT.org or find our podcast on most major podcast platforms. We also encourage you to like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. I'm Jeff Ray. I'll see you next week.
This WNIT local production has been made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.